You are surrounded by people who love you. And you are still lonely. Not the loneliness of someone who has no one. The loneliness of someone whose deepest self has never quite been reached. God sees that specific loneliness, and He placed this message in front of you today because of it. There is a loneliness that the world does not understand. Not the loneliness of someone who has no one. Not the loneliness of social isolation or obvious exclusion that other people can see and name and address. A different loneliness entirely, more subtle, more persistent, more difficult to describe to someone who has not lived it from the inside. The loneliness of someone who is surrounded, who is loved, who has relationships that are real, and communities that genuinely care, and who still feels in the deepest places a distance between themselves and everything around them that no amount of connection has been able to fully close. You know this loneliness, not as a concept, as a lived, embodied daily reality. The way it shows up in social gatherings where you smile and participate and give what the moment requires, while something in you remains behind a layer of glass, watching, feeling something you cannot quite bring into the conversation. The way it is present even in your closest relationships. Not because the people who love you do not love you genuinely, but because there is a place in you that no one seems to quite reach. A depth that the available connections have never fully touched. The way it intensifies sometimes at night. In that particular silence that is not the peaceful quiet of someone at rest, but the heavy silence of someone carrying something they have never been able to fully put down. And over time, over the seasons where this loneliness persisted, despite your efforts to resolve it, despite the relationships you built and the communities you joined and the connections you sought, you may have begun to give it an interpretation. You may have begun to read this loneliness as evidence of something wrong with you, as proof that something in you is fundamentally difficult to love fully, as the sign that you have not yet found how to connect in the way others seem to do naturally. Chosen, I am speaking directly to you, not to a general audience, to you who are watching this video at this precise moment, to you who know exactly which loneliness I am describing because you have been carrying it long enough to have stopped trying to explain it to most people. This message exists to give you a completely different interpretation of this loneliness, not to minimize it or pretend it does not hurt. It hurts, deeply. And that pain is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged fully. But this loneliness you carry, this distance between you and the world around you that you have never been able to fully explain, is not a defect. It is a design, and understanding what it was designed for changes everything. Let me describe with precision what this particular loneliness does to a person from the inside, with the kind of precision that only comes from having inhabited it rather than simply observed it. The first thing it does is create a double interior life. Not a double life in any moral sense, but a life that operates on two levels simultaneously. The visible level, the one that others see, the one that shows up in social interactions, that laughs and participates and gives the impression of full presence, and the invisible level, the one that watches all of this from the inside, the one that feels things that the visible level cannot express, the one that carries questions and depths and intensities that the available spaces never quite seem able to hold. This double life is exhausting in a way that people who do not live it rarely fully understand. Not the exhaustion of physical effort or even intense intellectual work, but the exhaustion of the constant management of the gap between what you actually feel and what the contexts around you can receive. The exhaustion of perpetually translating, of taking what lives at the invisible level and rendering it digestible enough for the visible level without distorting it so completely that it loses its meaning. And the fatigue of this constant translation work, performed every day, in every interaction, without ever really being able to set it down, is a deep and chronic fatigue that few people in your life identify for what it actually is. There is also something that this loneliness does to your relationship with spiritual community. For most people who carry this deep loneliness and who have sought to resolve it in spiritual spaces, there has been a painful discovery. Spiritual community, for all its real value and genuine beauty, is not always the place where inner depth can be fully received. There is often in spiritual communities a pressure toward a certain kind of conformity, toward a particular expression of faith, toward certain formulas of the spiritual life, toward a specific way of testifying to the experience of God. That leaves little space for the person whose inner experience does not quite fit the available formats, and you may have found yourself doing in spiritual spaces exactly what you do in social spaces, presenting the adapted version, using the expected language, expressing the experience in the forms that are recognized and valued, while internally something more complex, more nuanced, more difficult to categorize lived without space to fully unfold. Chosen. There is a last dimension of this wound that I want to name with honesty, because it is the one most universally carried by those who live this loneliness, and least often said out loud. It is the doubt about your own spiritual health that this loneliness can produce, because if you are a sincere believer, if your faith is real and your commitment to God is total, and you still live this persistent loneliness despite the promise of community and connection in the spiritual life, a question can begin to form in the silence. Is something wrong in my relationship with God? Is this loneliness a sign that I am not where I should be spiritually? Are others finding a connection that I am not finding because there is something in my way of approaching God that is fundamentally deficient? That question, carried in silence, rarely expressed because expressing it seems to be itself evidence of the problem it diagnoses, is one of the heaviest burdens that this loneliness can impose, and it deserves a direct and honest answer. Here is the truth that heaven wants to place in the deepest layer of your understanding today, with a clarity I hope reaches the most hidden places where the loneliness has planted its questions. Your loneliness is not evidence of lack, it is the sign of a preparation. This distinction between a lack and a preparation is the difference between a wound without meaning and a wound with a purpose, between something that is happening to you and something that is being done for you, between a condition to be healed and a process to be traversed. Moses, and I want you to look at his life not as a series of spectacular events, but as the precise map of a man who traversed the most complete and prolonged loneliness before being deployed in his mission. 40 years in the desert of Midian, 40 years away from Egypt where he had grown up, away from the Hebrew people he was supposed to liberate, away from any audience, any community, any confirmation that his life had meaning and direction. 40 years of loneliness, in a literal desert with sheep as his only company, and it was in that desert, in that total and prolonged solitude, that God spoke to him from a burning bush. In Exodus 3 verse 4, it is written, God called to him out of the bush, not from the court of Pharaoh, not from an assembly of believers, from the middle of the desert of his loneliness. The loneliness of Moses was not an obstacle to his encounter with God. It was the context God chose for that encounter. The loneliness had removed everything that could have competed with the voice of God. Every audience, every validation, every external confirmation, until nothing remained but God, and a man who was ready to hear him in a way that no more populated environment would have permitted. Here is the first truth I want to anchor in your understanding. Loneliness is the environment God chooses for the most important conversations, not all conversations, not every encounter with God, but the most defining ones, those that redefine who you are, that reveal what you were created for, that establish the foundation for everything that follows. Those conversations God has almost always with people in their desert, in their loneliness, in the space that the withdrawal of others has created, because those conversations require a quality of attention and a depth of listening that are only available when the noise of the world, including the well-meaning and loving noise of the people who surround you, is sufficiently reduced for his voice to be heard in its finest registers. Henri Nouwen, this priest and spiritual author, whose writings on solitude remain among the most profound ever produced, wrote in his book Reaching Out that solitude is the place of the great encounter, not the place from which we flee toward God, but the very place where God waits for us. He distinguished between imposed solitude, the kind that circumstances create and that we endure, and chosen solitude, the kind we inhabit deliberately as a space of divine encounter. And he said that transformation begins when we stop fleeing the first and begin receiving it as an invitation to the second. Here is the second truth. Your loneliness is forming you for a ministry that the crowd cannot produce. There exists a type of presence, the kind that certain people have, and that is immediately recognizable even if you cannot quite name it. A capacity to be genuinely present with another person in their depth, without being destabilized by it, without needing to fill it, or resolve it, or make it fit into a known category. This presence, this rare and precious capacity to accompany someone in their depth, can only be developed by someone who has themselves inhabited their own depth, who has learned to remain in the silence without fleeing it, who has developed the capacity to hold what is difficult to name without needing to name it immediately. In Psalm 23 verse 4, David writes, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Notice what God does not promise here. He does not promise that you will not walk through the valley. He promises His presence in the valley. And the presence of God at the bottom of the valley has a quality, an intimacy, a precision, a depth, that the presence of God on the sunny heights cannot produce. Not because God is more present in the valley, but because in the valley everything else is stripped away and only His presence remains. Here is the third truth, and this is the one I want you to carry long after this message ends. Your loneliness is not permanent, it is preparatory. All the great loneliness in Scripture had an end, not an end that returned to what was before, an end that opened onto something new and larger. Moses came out of the desert of his loneliness toward the greatest mission of his life. David came out of his years of solitary flight toward the throne of Israel. And John the Baptist, of whom Luke 1 verse 80 says that he was in the deserts until the day of his public manifestation in Israel, came out of his desert of loneliness to prepare the way of the Messiah himself. T.D. Jakes often says that God prepares us in private for what He will reveal in public. The loneliness is not the place where your life stops. It is the place where it is truly beginning. Chosen. My question for you today is this. If you could receive your loneliness as a divine invitation rather than as a defect to correct, how would you inhabit it differently? Let that question find the places in you where the loneliness has been most painful, because those are the places where the divine encounter has been deepest. Let me show you what happens in a life when someone stops fleeing their loneliness and begins to inhabit it. When they stop reading it as a problem to solve and begin receiving it as a space to inhabit with intention and openness. The first transformation that happens is almost imperceptible at first. It happens in the quality of their interior presence before this shift. For someone who has spent years fleeing loneliness or enduring it without understanding it, there is often a chronic interior restlessness, a need to fill the silent spaces, a difficulty in remaining still without something in them beginning to stir. This restlessness is not a character flaw. It is the natural response of someone who has learned to associate silence with pain. The pain of unreceived, ununderstood, uninhabited loneliness. When the loneliness begins to be received as a space of encounter rather than a place to flee, something changes in the relationship with interior silence. It begins to lose its threatening character. Not overnight, not in a linear way, but progressively. In the moments where you sit with your loneliness without immediately seeking to fill it or resolve it, you begin to discover that something lives in that silence. A presence, a voice, a depth of access to yourself and to God that is only available when the external and internal noise is sufficiently reduced. The second transformation is in the way they accompany others. Someone who has learned to inhabit their own loneliness with meaning, who has developed the capacity to remain in the difficult space without fleeing it, acquires a particular presence in relationships, a capacity to sit with another person in their depth without needing to resolve it, without needing to fill it with words that, however well-meaning, often serve as much to relieve the discomfort of the witness as to help the person who is suffering. This capacity, this silent and stable presence that can hold another person's depth without being destabilized by it, is one of the rarest and most precious gifts one human being can offer another. And it can only be developed by someone who has themselves inhabited their own depth long enough to stop being afraid of it, who has learned that the silence is not empty, that it is inhabited, that the depth is not dangerous, that it is the place of the most real encounter. The third transformation is in their relationship with God. There is a quality of intimacy with God, a direct, personal, unmediated knowledge that can only develop in prolonged loneliness. Not because God is absent in community, but because in community his voice is one among many. The voices of the people you love, the voices of the teachings you receive, the voices of the collective experiences of faith. All of these voices are precious, but they can also, without our realizing it, become the primary way we receive God. Second-hand, mediated by others, filtered through the experiences and interpretations of those around us. In the loneliness, in the space where those intermediate voices are absent, something becomes possible that is not possible in community. A direct encounter, a conversation without intermediary, a knowledge of God that comes not from what others say about him, but from what you discover about him yourself in the silence of your own interior experience. This direct knowledge, earned in loneliness, forged in the desert of your own interior distance, is of a depth and permanence that nothing else can produce. The fourth transformation, the one that makes all the others possible, is in the way they understand their own identity. Before having learned to inhabit their loneliness with meaning, most people construct a significant portion of their self-understanding through the gaze of others. Through relationships, through roles and belongings and confirmations that social life provides. In the loneliness, when those external sources are absent or insufficient, an opportunity emerges that social life cannot easily create, the opportunity to encounter who you are outside of all the social mirrors that normally define you. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when no role structures you? Who are you when the external confirmations are absent, and the only thing available is what God says about you? The answers to those questions, found in loneliness, through the long and sometimes painful process of encountering yourself without the usual mediations, are of a solidity and permanence that identities built on the gaze of others can never reach, because they do not depend on any circumstance to be maintained, because they are rooted in something deeper and more stable than anything the world can give or take away. Chosen. I want to finish with this. Your loneliness is not a mistake in your life. It is not evidence that you missed something important or that you have not yet found how to connect the way others seem to. It is not punishment or the result of a fundamental defect in who you are. Your loneliness is sacred space, a space that God chose, not arbitrarily, but precisely, knowing exactly what you needed and what you were destined for, to do work in you that the crowd cannot do, to speak to you in a way that the noise of the world does not permit, to form you with a depth and precision that require the silence that only loneliness can create. And what he has built in you through this loneliness, the depth of knowledge of himself, the quality of presence you can offer others, the interior stability that does not depend on circumstances to be maintained, the capacity to listen to what is difficult to hear, all of it is of a value and a rarity that you have not yet fully measured. But the people who need it most, those who are in their own desert of loneliness and who need to see that someone else has been there and has come out carrying something real, those people will see it immediately when you are before them. Your loneliness is preparing you for them, to be the presence they need, to carry the testimony that their loneliness also has meaning, to show them, not necessarily with words but with who you have become in your desert, that the silence of God is never empty, and that the distance you feel from everything is never abandonment. Continue to inhabit your loneliness with intention. Continue to receive it as sacred space rather than as a problem to solve. Continue to seek God in the silence it creates, because it is in that silence, in that particular desert that has your name on it, that the most important encounter of your life continues to happen. What breaks you open is what lets the light in.